Walking in this city, Philadelphia, means constantly confronting the work of history. That's true of walking anywhere, in any city. Every city has a history. But it's not too provincial to argue that in Philadelphia, there's a very particular history work being wielded. For 250 years, history in Philadelphia has been mobilized to produce some of the grandest narratives of American exceptionalism, centered around some of the most iconic and well-recognized historic sites in this country. But not here, on South Street. The site is actually quite extraordinary. In 1766, this was home to the Southwark Theater, the very first permanent theater in the American colonies. It was located here on the south side of South Street because in 1766 it was outside the boundaries of the municipal city, much like the Globe Theatre in London was on the south bank of the Thames. As you can see, the building is long gone. It was gutted by fire in 1823, and the last remnants were torn down in the 20th century. Why is it no longer here? Well, the easy answer to make is that theatre and music venues are rarely treated with a lot of respect. The Globe Theatre in London, after all, is not original, it's a reconstruction. But also, maybe we could say that if Philadelphia is needed to tell a particular story about the United States, theatre and music is not exactly part of that story. When we think of the grandest narratives of American nationalism in Philadelphia, we're probably thinking of this place, Independence Hall. This was the building where both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were signed, one of the first places in the country that the United Nations deemed a World Heritage Site. The official UNESCO statement barely mentions the actual building, but it is a real physical place in the heart of Center City, Philly. Its life began in 1732 when the colonial legislature in Pennsylvania needed a permanent home for their meetings. It was clad in red brick and resembled more a Georgian country mansion than its grand Whitehall counterparts in London. Locals tried to improve upon the appearance of the State House, attempting to add a tower to house clocks and a bell. The tower was so poorly constructed and poorly maintained it needed to be demolished by 1781. The bell was even worse. Manufactured for the colonies on the cheap, it, rather famously, developed a large crack, which didn't matter too much since the bell tower was too weak to hold it. Inauspicious, but we know that nationalist myths of origin of any nation don't just reproduce themselves magically. They have to be maintained, taught to children in school every year, and enforced by the Supreme Court every term. To remember that the United States is special and different, we need holidays and parades, required textbooks and pledges of allegiance, and we need Independence Hall, the Liberty Bell, and Philadelphia. But this walking tour of Philadelphia is an exercise in historiography, the academic study of how we do history. Independence Hall is a real object from the 18th century, but look what surrounds it: emptiness. Independence Hall didn't used to be like this. For several centuries, these blocks were some of the oldest, most crowded, and most diverse neighborhoods of Philadelphia. In the 1950s, these dense blocks of banks, commercial buildings, and houses were demolished to provide a more suitable, grand, patriotic, almost martial vista. You can still see the succeeding generations of industries surrounding the mall, a mid-century chemical company headquarters, some 19th century banks, a very expensive condo building. Ironically, this green vacuum in the heart of Philadelphia makes Independence Hall seem strangely small. Here are two questions I want us to think about as we walk around Independence Mall. First is the easy one. What history do we choose to conserve? Second, and more difficult, what do we do with the gaps of history? Those things that have been demolished, forgotten, maybe even impossible to remember. How do we fill those gaps? It might be strange to listen to a lecture about U.S. history from a music historian, but here's what I have to offer. In music, we rarely have as much access to historic sites and preserved physical objects as we saw with the Southwark Theater. But that absence can be a blessing. The advantage of performance is that it is much harder to demolish. And what if performance, music, theater, art, even maybe activism, can do a better job of helping us to interpret and reinterpret history, or at least open up the possibilities? After all, we musicians bring with us a lot of experience in wrestling with texts from the distant past. When we perform a piece of music written hundreds of years ago, we rarely do so just to preserve it as an empty shell. We do it to create a new experience for contemporary audiences. And here's a long-standing debate in musicology that I think might be a useful tool. If you are performing a piece of music from the 18th century, say a Bach keyboard partita, do you try to mimic Bach's original instrument and performance style? If you have a goal of communicating the spirit of Bach, performing on a period-appropriate harpsichord might foreground the historicness, but make it harder for contemporary listener to connect. On the other hand, you could perform that piece on a modern piano, itself a relic of a very different era of romanticism and industrialization. That could make it easier for some modern listeners to connect with the music, but are you losing that sense of history? And maybe that's not a bad way to think about all history, as if it were a score, and we are musicians trying to perform it. What follows is an experiment in thinking about history as performance. We have plenty of real historic buildings in Philadelphia, but my scope here is what I think of as fake historic buildings, modern recreations of once important historic sites. Again, our two questions: what history do we preserve, and how do we fill in the gaps? And with our musicology in mind, what is the relationship between historic facts, their historicity as we say, and what we want to accomplish with them? Let's look at two of these fake historic buildings that show two sides of that debate. Both date back to the bicentennial. Ironically, this first one was also a music venue, and we're not far away from the Southwark Theater. We're here at the City Tavern. Like the theater, the original City Tavern was destroyed by fire in the early 19th century. But prior to that, it had been a prime meeting spot for the new country's elite. And it was a prime musical venue as well. Most notably, the Anglo-American composer Alexander Reinagel came here in 1786 to revive a concert series. Modeled on similar concerts in London, the series often included symphonies, songs, overtures, sometimes a Mozart keyboard work performed by Reinagel himself, who had personally known Mozart. George Washington attended one of these concerts while presiding over the Constitutional Convention in 1787. As he wrote in his diary, dined at Mr. Morris's and drunk tea there, went afterwards to the concert at the City Tavern. This reconstructed building was commissioned by the National Park Service for the 1976 bicentennial, and for almost 50 years operated as a commercial restaurant. We could see it as quite laudable, bringing the actual social world of the 18th century back to life, alongside the famous political sites. But how successful was it? The historian Michael Zuckerman observed that the reconstructed City Tavern was really just a shell. There are no Mozart symphonies being performed in here, nor political deals being wielded in back rooms. It was just a restaurant, and a rather kitschy one, like a Disneyland version of the past that pretends like nothing has happened since, except maybe for health codes. And of course, today, for 2026's semi-quincentennial, the City Tavern is empty. It went bankrupt during the pandemic and remains vacant. If the City Tavern used a faithful reconstruction to attempt to capture the spirit of the past, here's the radical opposite. We're entering what was once the home of Benjamin Franklin. This space didn't burn down, the land simply became too valuable, and his heirs tore it down themselves in the 19th century. Unlike the City Tavern, there's no reconstruction here. In fact, you might think of it as only the shell, but self-evidently so. The architect Robert Venturi designed what we call a ghost house, an empty frame. We're encouraged to use our imagination to see the past, and to allow the present to become part of the story. So if we understand these two different approaches, let's apply them to the site that might in some ways be the most symbolically important and yet volatile sites in U.S. history. Not the spot where the Declaration of Independence was signed, but where, almost exactly 250 years ago, Thomas Jefferson actually wrote the thing. You'll not be surprised at this point to learn that the original building was demolished in the 19th century. As you can see, this reconstruction went the city tavern route and tried to mimic the original form of the building. However, if the tavern was only a shell, this building is even emptier. Its construction in the 1970s and later lack of maintenance means it's unsafe for the public to enter currently, and it sits particularly isolated on this stretch of Market Street, across the street from a parking garage and some vacant department stores. In 2024, the artist Sonia Clark created a public art project called The Descendants of Monticello. Clark and a team of videographers recorded the eyes of the descendants of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, the enslaved black woman with whom he had a number of children, all of whom were enslaved as well. Large TV screens in the windows of Declaration House projected the eyes of the Hemings descendants through the windows of the empty house, blinking away relentlessly. It was a striking intervention, not just into hagiography of Jefferson and the potentially hollow words of the Declaration of Independence, but also into the hollow shell of the reconstructed building itself. We've seen some tension in these sites, in which the lived experience of life in the 18th century is both hard to capture in the material form of bricks and also sometimes ideologically inconvenient in the stories we want to tell for this country. Sometimes art can be a powerful intervention in these tensions. Here's one more example, one which this time uses nothing but performance itself. It's fitting to end here at the Liberty Bell. As the sculptor Michel Lopez notes, there's a, quote, complicated symbolism of the American Liberty Bell as an emblem of freedom and equality, which is also marked with failure. Its famed crack rendered the iconic hunk of cast iron broken and silent at its arrival. In September of 2021, Lopez conducted a sound walk using a piece of tape music composed for her by the sound artist Austin Fisher. Fisher assembled his work by collecting samples of popular music that mimics the sound of bells, both playful and pejorative, like Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. As one listens to the murmuring collage of samples, it slowly dawns that by isolating the ding-dong nonsense syllables of these songs, they gradually morph into the racist, childish slurs hurled in a sing-song voice at Asian Americans. This felt particularly fraught in the pandemic moment of 2021. Participants were invited to meet for a walking tour, led by Lopez, who in the manner of a tour guide carried a small blue flag emblazoned with words from a patriotic song, Let Rocks Their Silence Break. As the crowd began to follow her, Bluetooth speakers slowly came to life, playing the Fisher work. Quietly, the crowd moved on a pseudo-tour of the historic mall, past Independence Hall, and finally to the Liberty Bell. Just this past year, there was an extraordinary conflict around how we do history in Philadelphia. Behind me is the site of George Washington's house when he was president, when the Capitol was here in Philadelphia. Its last remnants were demolished when Independence Mall was created in the 1950s. But in 2010, thanks to the work of local activists, a memorial was created to the enslaved men and women that George Washington brought from Virginia to Philadelphia. As you can see, its design owes a great debt to the Benjamin Franklin ghost house we visited earlier. This past January, the Trump administration ordered all information about slavery to be stripped off the site, leaving it vandalized and empty, with the exception of a stone wall that they couldn't remove. In response, the original activists, with the support of the city, rallied and sued to have the signs put back up.
Black history is American history. African American history is American history. And we will stand and we will continue to fight to make sure that Donald Trump will not whitewash the history here in the city of Philadelphia. This is a movement.
You'll recall that I started with two questions. What history do we keep? And what do we do to fill in the gaps? On that second part, we've explored the variety of ways people have filled in the gaps of history through preservation, through reconstruction, through art, through activism. But as I said, the first question is actually quite easy to answer. What history do we keep? Don't listen to historians, listen to a musician. History isn't what happened. History is a story we tell about the future we want. Thank you.